Alright, so hello everyone. My name is Tyler Schmidt, and today I want to talk to you about the agenda setting theory. Now, before we begin, I want to ask you a question related to the theory. So, how many times have you been looking on a news outlet and you've seen the title Breaking News? Usually, this is seen by consumers of media as the most important, groundbreaking, newest discovery, biggest news. However, what you also might find is if you go on Fox, you might see that the breaking news has something to do with Trump or politics in general. If you go on CNN, it might have to do with a social issue. If you go on ABC, it might have to do with a forest fire somewhere. So, how come every single news outlet has their own version of breaking news? The biggest, most important news that everyone needs to know is different on every platform. This is because of the agenda setting theory, and that's what I want to talk about today. So, before we begin, I want to show you the agenda for today. First, I want to talk about what the agenda setting theory is, also some common examples of it, as well as why it's important to know, and then I want to tie everything together with an academic study at the end. So, without further ado, let's begin. So, according to our textbook and page 214 in specific, the agenda setting theory explains that the media sets the agenda for the public. The media tells people what is important by the number of times a story is reported, and, by implication, if they don't report on a story or bury it in the back pages of a newspaper, they indicate what stories are unimportant. So, to put into simpler terms, the agenda setting theory is an idea used by the media to promote specific stories, and these promoted stories are seen as the most important by consumers of that media channel. So, for example, Fox is a very well known red favoring news outlet, and because of that, the stories that they might choose to show might put Democrats like in a bad light, or it might shine good light on Republican stories. Versus if you go on a different news outlet, they might try and highlight the benefits of a Democrat explanation or a Democrat situation. Basically, what the agenda setting theory allows for is for news outlets and other media sources to basically decide what they think is important and therefore is what they show online. Some common examples of this are in politics and social issues. Starting with politics, let's say that Donald Trump was talking about building a wall between the United States and Mexico a few years back. This was groundbreaking news because it had never been done before, and all of the news outlets wanted to talk about it. However, how they talked about this idea was different. Some criticized him, some thought it was a great idea, and it depended on what news outlet you looked at. That determined the information you received on Trump building the wall. Moving on to social issues, this is where it is probably the most common. Some news outlets might see violence against minorities as very important, and therefore they show that to their audience. Some other news outlets might talk about abortion bans all around the states, and that's what they show. It really just depends on what the news outlet thinks is important. And unfortunately, it is very common and is also very important to understand. And the reason that is because the agenda setting theory has the ability to shape public opinion. And what I mean by this is if every single news outlet talks about the biggest, most groundbreaking story, then everyone would have the information required. However, some news outlets choose to not promote specific stories, and because of that, other stories are brought to be the most important, which can ultimately shape the public's opinion. if they're only receiving information that, let's say, Republicans are evil, then they're going to start believing that. Whereas information about the Republicans doing a good job in office is being pushed down to the bottom of news outlets. It's either being shown at the back of the paper or later at night when people aren't watching. People might start to get this bad rap of Republicans. And on top of that, it can even influence policymakers. And what I mean by that is if a policymaker sees in the news that people are outraged about a specific problem or idea because it's being shown to them so much. For example, let's take the forest fires. The forest fires in California were very impactful and were shown to everyone all across the world. This caused a major boost in environmentalism and people worrying about global emissions. Now, as someone from New Jersey, unfortunately, the forest fires in California don't mean a lot to me. Yes, it's bad and it's my country, but at the same time, I didn't experience any of the negative effects about it. But things happening in New York or Philadelphia that do impact me, I didn't hear about. And that's because this idea was brought to everyone's attention because it was able to get news outlets more views, more clicks, more attention. And that's why it's important to understand. Because if you look at what the media is presenting to you, and you take it with a grain of salt and understands that they're only trying to get clicks, views, and attention, you understand why they decide to show different views, different opinions, different topics. And to tie all this together, I want to talk about an academic study that I found. And this study is by Maxwell E. McCombs and Donald L. Shaw, titled The Agenda Setting Function of Mass Media. What they found was that political news follows the campaign process more than the actual political ideas followed by the campaigners. And to quote, 30% of Humphrey's and 25% of Nixon's coverage was also about the campaign rather than their policy. To add a little bit of background to the study, it was done on the Nixon, Wallace, and Humphrey election of 1968. So that's where they're getting all of this data from. It was specifically that election. And what they ended up finding was that different news outlets not only cover the process of the campaign, because that gets them more attention, but they also can choose what parts of a candidate's campaign they decide to show. So, for example, for Nixon, the most popular things shown online for him were campaign analysis, events, and foreign policy. For Humphrey, it was foreign policy, public welfare, and civil rights. And for Wallace, it was law and order and campaign analysis. I know it's hard to see, but the table on the slideshow here just shows the different values of what was shown and what wasn't relating to the information I just shared. So what ended up happening was voters' perceptions aligned with the shown topics. So since Humphrey was the only candidate who was shown like civil rights often, people believed he was the best for civil rights. It's the same for Wallace, where his law and order was the main thing shown for him and not the other candidates. People started to believe he was the best for law and order. And while yes, this might be true, you also have to understand that half of this information is not being shown to the public. What is being shown is what gets the media clicks, attention, and views. And to conclude the study, they found that yes, the agenda setting theory does work. And to quote, voters tend to share the media's composite definition of what is important, and it strongly suggests an agenda setting function of mass media. Basically, what they found was that the agenda setting theory did work. Media outlets showing specific ideas for each candidate did actually change what people thought about them. But one thing that the study did, however, find out was that consider that both levels as a communication concept, agenda setting seems useful for the study of political consensus. So what they were saying is that both a psychological and a sociological approach was required to understand the true impacts of the agenda setting theory. So not only do you have to understand people's perceptions and attitudes towards each opinion, you also have to talk about their social class and their education and how what these campaigners are talking about directly affects them and their voting. So yes, the agenda setting theory did work. However, perceptions and attitudes and social class and education were more important. To summarize, the agenda setting theory manipulates what people view as important. This is done by media outlets showing specific stories and titling them as important, and taking other stories and pushing them down to the bottom or raising those initial stories up. It also affects public policy and can even shape how people view different topics, and it's seen all over the news. So, with that being said, it's important to understand the information that you are getting and to take it all with a grain of salt to make sure you understand all sides. Thank you very much.